All set. Wait a
Oh,
second.
I'm
Hold it. All righty then. Welcome to the new time for weekly marks. Although we're a little late in the normal opening. I represent old age. I would note that it's been an exciting week, and more craziness has occurred, and uh, it appears as if the Democratic Party is imploding, but I think that some people are deliberately trying to make it implode for the usual reasons. I was thinking about that simply because you have all the money still counts. It still relates to what I'm going to talk about. And people with big money seem to think they have more say in the matter than those of us plebeians or members of the party, even in that sense. So party discipline is sort of at risk at the present moment. It's uh, it's just interesting. I mean, there's a fight about whether the polling data is good or bad, and some people are relying on their usual pollsters, and then there's like a fight between what's his name, the guy who took over 538, and Nate Silver. So, and then they're trashing Nate Silver because he works for I think a cyber currency firm now. They must have given him a lot of money. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, but sort of an interesting story you might consider. So, in my thinking about relocating weekly marks, I decided, well, maybe we should continue to hope that people are going to do their own reading, and not unlike the kind of reading that's being required over at Class Unity, which is the reason why we were doing Sundays with Class Unity for a couple of weeks. Well, I think 10 weeks or something, or 15 weeks. Or uh, so that this is, I'm back at a value, price, and profit. And I think as reading 19th century verse with Marx doesn't always make sense, just simply because of the way it's constructed, which on the one hand is good if you're reading Jane Austen, but not so good if you're reading Marx. Um, and there's no Mr. Darcy. Anyway, I came across a new reading guide for value, price, and profit. Um, and it's at a site that is another communist site. It has a reading guide built into it, which asks questions. And so I proposed to myself, okay, it's got study questions. Now, what if I feed the study questions to Gemini, the Google's AI, to see if it could answer my question? And it actually responded in a reasonable way immediately, and that's sort of useful. But then when I made an alteration and asked, because I was just amused in terms of doing a search that John Romer teaches at Yale, uh, and is cross associated with both political science and econ. Um, he's interested in a variety of things, but I recall that he did something that was called value class exploitation and class or something, and it's similar to value, price, and profit. But I was more interested in if he had somewhere a commentary, which would be relatively simple because value, price, and profit is a relatively simple document. And so I fed it to Gemini, and it made a big error, which was sort of interesting, but it defaulted to a certain way of talking about the topic itself, value, price, and profit. And that was sort of interesting just because it was making a mistake, but it was sort of covering its ass by sort of doing something very similar, but not identical. And that I kind of like those mistakes that the AI makes when, as I've indicated before, if you asked it a question about economy, that's one thing, and economy in some conjoined topic. But then if you asked it a question about political economy, it then would shift gears, and you get a really very different thing. And in fact, in certain cases, you would get voluminous things, which is actually sort of interesting. I mean, voluminous in the sense that there's a limit on which it's going to crank out stuff. And if you're probably, I think what's probably interesting, and probably first year students in college have learned this now, is that you can use AI to construct whole essays if you're, you know, worried about the reading. But if you've actually read the material, you could actually produce really interesting things. The problem, of course, is that I'm going to assume that the plagiarism software now includes AI protections and is probably smart enough to detect, oh, well, that's a CPT chat, blah, blah, blah. That has that kind of signature to it. And I do think that there is probably some sort of watermarking or whatever that indicates that. It's all very interesting. I don't teach anymore, so that's. But if I ever had to teach again, it would be sort of interesting to see that. It is unfortunate. It made me very concerned about teaching in general. The fact that I had to use automatic software to determine whether students were actually reading the material or not. Anyway, so there are communist reading guides, and we present here a reading guide to value, price, and profit, and delivered by Marx, series of lectures, General Counsel of the International Working Men's Association. First, remember, there have been at least 3 of them in reality. The 4th one is somewhat problematic, but people claim that it exists. That's an interesting question and worth studying, actually. And then, of course, there's the kind of comic versions, the 6th International, etc. So this is happening, of course, while he's working on the first volume of Capital, magnum opus. And so John Weston, a member of the General Council, representative of the English workers, follower of Robert Owen, proposed that the council should discuss 2 questions. First, the question of whether or not an increase in wages will improve in general the material conditions of the working class. And second, whether or not wage increases in one branch of industry will have a detrimental impact on other branches of industry. It's a perfectly reasonable kind of question in which he argues an increase in wages will not improve the material conditions of the working class, and that trade union organization, because its harmful impact on industry, is detrimental to the material interests of the working class. Interesting question. And you could say it's revisionist at one level, and in fact, you can argue it in the current day on the issue of labor aristocracy and rich guy unions, police unions, and airplane pilot unions, or doctors unions. The AMA does function as a kind of union as well. So that's an interesting question. Marx argued against Weston's conclusions. And Marx's counter report is so this is sort of publishing 2 counter examples, which are actually kind of interesting. Just the fact that, oh well, let's let the people sort of deal with this as a battling pamphlets. So there's mistakes built into this. The idea that Weston assumed a theory of wages fund, a fixed amount of capital from which capitalists pay the wages of workers, and it's interesting, but a problematic assumption. And so, but it is it can be used as a weapon, no differently than the way in which delegate votes are being used by the Democrats to do whatever they're going to do at the convention, which we still have a couple of weeks before. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. How transparent, and in fact, I would assert that people should be complaining about the relative transparency of this activity, because that's kind of where it's going to hinge. Who's talking to whom? Why is everyone being so passive aggressive? George Clooney, and all these other things that are going on, and we need to sort that out, not in a way that's going to be manipulated by the opposition, but in ways that support what I think the central message in the 2024 election is clearly one, a revolutionary question, if you will, an anti-MAGA message. That's kind of really what things should be focused on, and forget about who's going to be the person, because in some ways it may not be within our control. and we need to be sort of prepared for that. That's the kind of entryist sort of perspective that one needs to take. In other words, uh, Democrats who need to vote, but independents who need to vote need to get focused on the fundamental issue, and that is, fascism is at the doorstep, and I think it's really important to not let it even have a toehold. Hence, the theory is a weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie in their efforts to resist the economic struggles of the proletariat. And of course, if workers were not to participate in economic struggle, they would not understand the need for a political as well as an economic struggle to overthrow capitalism. In short, the implication of this theory, which Marx understood well, was that the class of wage laborers should be subservient to the class of capitalists. It was for this reason that Marx felt compelled to rebut Weston's claims, and they argued in favor of the economic struggle of the workers. And you can see that's just sort of the difference. It's revolutionary versus evolutionary. However, Marx explained this type of struggle as a means to an economic and political end, the abolition of capitalism and the rule of the working class. Marx's report was not published in his lifetime. Manuscript was found among his papers after the death of Engels and prepared for publication by Eleanor Marx and her husband, Edward Aveling. The latter added a preface to the text and reorganized it by inserting headings for the introduction and for the first 6 chapters. So you have some correspondences in here. Marx gives us a clear and concise exposition in the second half of the Labor Theory of Value, the relationship between wages and profits, and the nature and lessons of the struggle between capitalists and wage laborers, amongst other things. It is for this reason that this text is often recommended as an introduction to the first volume of Capital. And so those of you who haven't dove in or have been reading only summaries need to sort of, this is just another kind of summary. It's a kind of précis in many ways, originally designed for at least consumption of a small subset of, a workers' organization, the International. And of course, something not necessarily in Marx's original idea that he was going to get mass published, but for which his heirs decided, well, this is pretty concise and actually is relatively transparent, so that this should be given a wider publication. And in fact, it's a very useful little text and is widely read. And I assert that you should probably read it because it's a little simpler and doesn't get bogged down in Marx's math or arithmetic, and that's one thing that would be good. However, the fact that Marx presented this theory so clearly and concisely in Value, Price, and Profit is a considerable achievement, given his view, which he expressed in a letter to Engels of 20 May 1865, that a course of political economy cannot be compressed into 1 hour. Yet that's what I try and do every damn week. So is the text from the 1898 version, and there are different versions, yes. And of course, it's in many different languages. So, you can see that there's other issues. So I'm going to look at the preliminary section and then go to the Gemini answers for the discussion. So this is not going to take too long, and then we can move on to other matters, I suppose. Preliminary. By way of an introduction to the main parts of the text, Marx makes 2 preliminary remarks, both of which may be understood as pointing to the necessity for a leadership of the working class that is unified and theoretically well-informed. If the leadership lacks unity, settled convictions on the questions before it, such as whether or not to support striking workers' clamor for a rise of wages, or if it is unified but theoretically misinformed and makes practical mistakes in consequence, for example, by calling on striking workers not to demand higher wages, rank-and-file workers will lose confidence in it, a loss which, if not repaired, will become an impediment to the further development of the class struggle. Marx begins Production and Wages by calling into question the 2 related premises on which Citizen Weston's argument depended, that the quantity of national production and the real value of wages are fixed. The quantity of national production cannot be fixed, Marx tells us, because production statistics demonstrate that both the value and mass of production change from year to year. This is just in terms of the data. If there is an expansion in the scale of production from one year to the next, both the value of production, the total quantity of labor that's embodied in what is produced, and the mass of production, that is the total number of commodities that are produced, increase, that other things being equal. The other things being equal is the fundamental point. And if production becomes more efficient because productivity is increased, the total number of commodities that are produced within a year increases, but the value of each one decreases because each one is produced with a smaller amount of labor, other things being equal. Moreover, it is because the value of production changes from year to year that the supply of money changes from year to year, because money is needed to facilitate the circulation of value exchange throughout the economy. And that's kind of the whole, front end of capital in a nutshell. However, even if the quantity of the national product was fixed, Marx argues, it does not follow that real wages would be fixed, because a wage, which is one share of the value that the worker generates, is inversely related to another share of the value that the worker generates. That is profit. In other words, if production is to be profitable, capitalists must ensure a continual reduction in the value of the real wage, or the value of goods and services that the nominal wage can command in exchange. It's the whole point of offshoring production. What all this means is that capitalist production is a question not only of economics, of producing as efficiently as possible, but also of politics, of the power that one class in society, the capitalist class, has over another class in society, the working class. And so the first question for discussion, just on the preliminary, is how does the value and mass of national production change when the scale of production changes? And the big question, I asked Gemini about it. Here's how. So this is Gemini's answer. So in Value, Price, and Profit, the relationship between scale of production, value, and mass of national production is a nuanced one. Here's how Marx approaches it, and begins, of course, the labor theory of value. Marx's analysis hinges on the labor theory of value. This theory suggests that the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time required to produce it. This means the value reflects the average amount of labor time needed in a society to produce a particular good, considering the prevailing technology and skills. Now, there's an impact of scale on value, as I mentioned before. Constant returns. If increasing production simply replicates the existing production process, adding more machines of the same type, hiring more workers with the same skills, the value per unit of good wouldn't necessarily change. The total value of production would increase proportionally to the increase in output, the idea of mass. So there's constant returns to scale, as they say, decreasing returns to scale. Marx acknowledged the possibility of decreasing returns to scale. As production intensifies, there might be a shortage of skilled labor, raw materials, or limitations in managing a larger workforce. This could lead to inefficiencies and potential increase in the value per unit produced. Workers might need to put in extra effort to maintain output, or inefficiencies might arise in coordinating a larger production system. Limited long-term decreases in scale. However, Marx argued that true long-term decreases in value due to increasing scale were unlikely. He believed technological advancements would generally accompany the expansion of production, offsetting inefficiencies and potentially leading to constant or ever decrease or even decreasing value per unit. This is the idea of, this is sort of part of the transformation problem. The mass of national production. The mass of national production, the total quantity of goods and services produced, would always increase with an increase in the scale of production. This is because more workers and machines are producing more units. Key points to remember. See, I like the AI. I like sort of has this template that it sort of operates on. And so if you ask a certain type of question, it tries to give you a kind of synopsis or an outline, which is probably its only best use at the present moment. Socially necessary labor time. Determining the exact amount of socially necessary labor can be complex. It considers not just the direct labor involved in production, but also the labor required to produce the machinery, tools, and raw materials needed. That's indirect labor in one sense. Focus on exploitation. While the scale of production might influence value, Marx's primary focus was on how the capitalist system extracts surplus value from labor. Even with increased efficiency, a larger output could still generate more surplus value. Whatever. Sorry, I sneezed. Um, it's it could generate more surplus value for capitalists while keeping wages stagnant. So there's an example, and that's a good thing. Imagine a textile factory. Initially, each yard of fabric takes 1 hour of labor to produce. If the factory expands and adds more looms without significant technological advancement, the value per yard might remain relatively constant. However, there could be some pressure on workers to maintain output with the increased workload. If the factory adopts new weaving technology that automates some tasks, the value per yard might decrease due to less labor required. But Marx would argue that even with this efficiency gain, the owner might still capture most of the benefit as surplus value and not necessarily share it with workers through higher wages. So overall, in value, price, and profit, Marx emphasizes how the scale of production can influence the total value and mass of national production, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a significant decrease in the value per unit produced in the long run, especially with technological advancements. His main concern lies with how the capitalist system exploits labor regardless of the production scale. So you can see that there's a larger framework under which Marx is operating, and that some of this is indicated even in the preliminary section. Now, my second question, to ask a question of the AI, Gemini, uh, what does John Romer think about the book or the pamphlet Value, Price, and Profit? It ran around because all it is a an algorithmic search deal. It came across Value, Exploitation, and Class, a brief book by Romer. So it's sort of doing that kind of work, but trying to plug it in an interesting way, but not doing it in a sufficiently comparative way, but which you could do in asking a follow-up a query of it. So anyway, John Romer's book, which I think is from Value, Exploitation, and Class, the relationship between the scale of production, value, and mass of national production is a complex one. Here's a breakdown of the potential effects. So it still got there. The AI got there. Value and scale. Right? We're talking about scale above in Marx's original text. Whereas Romer, sort of gets there. And in fact, if you were going to look at, there's a way that you can analyze Romer's book, and I wouldn't do it, but you can imagine a Stalinist government that would say, well, how Marxist is John Romer? And that would ask an AI, and it would make some kind of analysis, assuming that, sort of conceptually and textually, you could determine how Marxist someone is. So constant returns, if the production process exhibits constant returns to scale, increasing the scale of production, that is producing more with the same technology, sounds the same as Marx, wouldn't necessarily change the value of good per unit of good produced. The total value of production would simply increase proportionally to the increase in output mass. So essentially, it is giving us what Marx gives us. Decreasing returns. With decreasing returns to scale, as production increases, the value per unit might also increase. This could happen due to resource scarcity or inefficiencies in managing a larger production process. The total value of production might increase, but at a lower scale, slower rate than the increase in output. Increasing returns. In some cases, increasing the scale of production might lead to economies of scale, making production more efficient. This would result in a decrease in the value per unit produced. The total value of production would likely increase at a faster rate than the increase in output. Mass of national production. The mass of national production, which refers to the total quantity of goods and services produced, always increases when the scale of production increases. This is because you're simply producing more units. Key points to consider. Romer's book focuses on labor theory of value, which suggests that the value of a good is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor required to produce it. However, the concept of socially necessary labor itself can be debated, especially when considering economies of scale. Technological advances can also play a role. New technologies might allow for increased production without significant changes in value per output. And so here's the Romer example, which, sort of different. Imagine a bakery that produces bread. initially, each loaf might take 1 hour of labor to produce, resulting in a specific value per loaf. If the bakery expands production and adopts new ovens that make the process more efficient, that is, increasing the scale, they might be able to produce more loaves in less time per loaf. This could lead to a decrease in the value per loaf due to economies of scale, while the total number of loaves produced, that is, the mass of national production, increases significantly. Overall, the impact of changes in scale on value and mass of national production depends on the specific production processes, technological factors, and how the concept of socially necessary labor is applied. Romer's book likely explores these complexities in more detail, providing a framework for analyzing these relationships. Now, the whole point, though, is that Romer, while addressing some of these issues on the socially necessary labor, is really trying to work on something different and is more about, well, what happens when you achieve revolution and the socialists come and get in charge? How are they going to deal with this? So that's kind of the underlying question, not thought about necessarily by Marx in this pamphlet. So anyway, there are more questions, things about wages and profit, and there's stuff. Stuff. The focus here, of course, is on a kind of outline for volume 1 of Capital, and introducing certain things like money. The monetary transactions are different every day, so you can't really talk about fixed money. That's the one thing. And in terms of supply and demand, there are a whole bunch of other questions. So determining the exchange value of labor power, the wage standard or point of reference, remains still unanswered. It needs to be worked out in a much deeper way. And in wages and prices, he tries to work out that wages might determine prices. This is from Ricardo and Smith. That there's a difference among wage rates and determining the wage rates, as well as determining prices. So it's just incredibly problematic. There's certain tautological things that just simply don't make any sense. So what is value then? See, if you start with the commodity and then you work through the question of, well, what's the value of commodity? How is it that we get to that? And what are these exchange values that we've been yakking about? And so value seems even more abstract. But the point is, of course, that what you want to do is work out some sort of sets of averages. That's what Marx is looking at, because he's trying to get to a kind of generalized view of what perhaps value would be for a nation, because national statistics are the thing that are sort of at work here in the mid-19th century. It's so difficult. You could sort of get to a micro level of, well, what's the data for a specific kind of industry, because you have the reports on industries relative to the British economy, and some of them are accurate, some of them are sort of garbage in, garbage out, because who is reporting, right? The capitalists are reporting. So there are certain presuppositions that reflect the different social relations. The capitalists will write a report that says that everything's okay, and that how is that we can measure these differences? Well, in some ways, we can only measure them because of their differences. Now, this changes, of course, for a variety of theoretical reasons, and the analysis gets better in the 19th century. There's a whole line of inquiry that's looking more at marginal differences, and that's where, as I've said before, Marx should have had a professorial position somewhere. He would have fixed all these problems. Productivity, then, is a property of the system of production, and then the social powers of labor are at work here. And then he starts talking about what is the monetary expression of this value that we've been querying about, and the question of prices. Now, prices are an easy kind of thing to use as an indicator of something, but the fact is prices change. And as I tried to express last night, about the question of shrinkage and prices, price is not always a good indicator for what actually is going on. And determining market price is not always quite as obvious or clear as we might look at. The existence of profit cannot be explained by the selling of a commodity at a price that is above its exchange value, what is known as surcharging. So the inflation doesn't necessarily tell us. Uh, um, in some ways, it doesn't tell us anything about purchasing power, which, not unlike labor power, is not quite, it's not as real as we might think. Now we can understand why it's a mistake to treat labor as a commodity and try to work out what it determines its value. The result is, in Marx's word, an irrational application of value. We can also understand why the phrase value of labor is tautological, because to speak of the value of labor is to presuppose that value is a concept that is independent of the concept of labor. So, this is the problem of as a category or categorization problem. Therefore, if it is a mistake to think of labor as a commodity, the correction of this mistake is to think of labor power as what is bought and sold. So it's further abstraction, but it's a worthy abstraction for Marx, because it allows us to think about certain expectations that begin to lurch into kind of an ideological position. Is that, what does a capitalist expect? There's a certain idea of expectations of what the capitalist wants to do and what the laborer wants to do relative to sustenance or to sustainability. So that's kind of this is where the conflicts are. But the conflicts are not at this basic level of money. It's really much larger questions. These are Hegelian type questions. Well, you can view them as Hegelian questions, but these other things that are also more abstract. That is, the quality of life you live, and the quality of family life, and the quality of your life in society. All of these things. Some of them are relatively vulgar, like more time in the bar, more time watching television, blah blah blah. Anyway, so the exchange value of laboring power is determined by certain necessaries or necessities, and that are required for perpetuation of this. So this is a question of redetermining what counts as actual labor, what counts as wages in relationship to that. Understanding, of course, so we still have that same problem today, as I've continued to say, is that what you get on your paycheck, the final paycheck, has these other things that are redistributed, that, and you can see, unfortunately, there's some transparency to it, but what's going on, you can see that in the paycheck, but you can sort of not use the paycheck or other things are going on beyond the way your pay stub looks. Let's put it that way. Marx begins by reminding us, in the production of surplus value, when purchasing labor power, the capitalist acquires the right to consume or use that power. And so, therefore, it is a question of ownership or property, in terms of owning the capacity to work via the employment contract, and how much control power the capitalist has over the labor power. And so there is the question of necessity, the question of surplus being created, and we've gone through that at great length about relative versus absolute. And in the terms of writing a pamphlet, you would certainly write it in a way that says, oh, okay, that's why they want us to work overtime, or they only give us time and a half, not double time or whatever. Or they give us time and a half, and is that sufficiently compensatory? That's the underlying question. All this means is the exchange value of labor power, which is determined by the quantity of labor necessary to maintain or reproduce it, is distinct from the use or exercise of labor power, which is limited only by the physical and intellectual capacities of labor. You can see that there's sort of a difference there. The difference, as some other theorists have mentioned, the difference between a means of production and labor power, which is always problematic, particularly for those of us who work more in knowledge than in physical stuff. So the origin of surplus value, therefore, lies in the unequal exchange between the capitalist and labor. The capitalist receives from the exercise of labor power a value of produce that is greater than the value of the labor power that the capitalist purchased, while the laborer receives through the wage a value that is less than the total value of what has been produced. It is this sort of exchange, Marx concludes, upon which capitalistic production or the wages system is founded, and which must constantly result in reproducing the working man as working man and the capitalist as capitalist. So reproduction, that is producing iteratively, is important. And what is the value of this labor? And it is a different question of value or price of labor and power as opposed to the price of or value of labor itself. And so it is through this by which you can generate a kind of surplus value or profit for the capitalist appears to them as just paid labor. And in fact, that's kind of generally what goes on. So profit is made by selling a commodity at its value. This is not its value at production, but value as exchange. This is the whole business of reading capital, is to decide, okay, well, there's a sort of pricing determined through all kinds of accounting business, but when you get to exchange, it becomes more problematic. And so anyway, so there is amount of profit that is being generated from this, and the rate of profit being and this is the only math that appears. So anyway, there's a general relation that we can conclude from all of this. And so there's an inverse relationship between wages and profits, that if wages rise, the rate of profit must fall, whereas if wages fall, the rate of profit must rise. Now, this differential rate is actually a really important one because we can see how that operates in global capitalism. And Marx's conclusion is, well, this is the antagonisms of, work versus control or command. That struggle can only be resolved through a revolution, through the class of waged laborers taking ownership of the means of production and deciding democratically how to distribute the product of labor. In the second half chapter, Marx considers the nature of the relationship between exchange value and price. He argues that although the exchange value of a commodity is determined by the labor time embodied within it, this value is not fixed. It will change as the productive power of the labor employed changes. So in other words, there is a differential relationship between these two things, in some cases reciprocal. So there are, a whole bunch of histories of these kinds of struggles over these matters, and issues that revolve around most of the kinds of working class things about, length of the working day, how much work is being required, intensity of labor, type of labor, children versus women versus men, and then the impact on wages of the economic cycle. Of wages on the economic cycle. So all that's kind of working through there. The present state of the economy is that equitable wages have lagged behind, other things. And now we're in a false argument about, inflationary prices. Well, the next step should be, well, if it's inflationary prices, why don't we get higher wages to compensate, considering, the where we are? And of course, the capitalists will go, oh, no, that's not important. You got to vote for Trump, and prosperity will trickle down because people are making more money at the top, and this prosperity will cast. They don't say it quite that way, but the implication is always, oh, well, the capitalist system is so good and shouldn't be regulated, and blah 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 blah. And so all that will increase wealth, and therefore you will benefit eventually. Well, of course, there are limits to that, and historical experience shows that it's possible for capitalists to exceed not only the social, but the physical limit to the value of labor power. In other words, to pay wages so long the recipients need some kind of state welfare or charity to get by, hence the emergence of the current welfare state. And you can see that spread in different directions. And of course, that doesn't prevent, people like the Republicans to sort of cut that in all directions, as Project 2025 does. In order to compensate at a cost level, so that your wages won't necessarily go up, but we're going to kill all these benefits that so that a certain portion of the class will think that they are benefiting. The actual rate of profit and the actual level of the wage and length of the working day will therefore be determined by the outcome of the struggle that ensues between the class of capitalists and the class of laborers. The 2024 election is no different. In the short term, therefore, workers should certainly organize themselves into trade unions to develop their strength as a class in the struggle against the capitalists. But in the long term, they must go further than resistance and use their collective strength as a lever for the final emancipation of the labor class. So that's kind of, what the deal is. Uh, and sort of our approach to that, or labor's approach to that, is, of course, has been problematic in all at all levels and in all professions. In education, it's class size that becomes important because you only have X amount of minutes and you have Y amount of students, and you got to allocate this in a way that sort of can be, dealt with in a certain way. Now, this is the standard sort of assembly line model for education that Paulo Freire, says, well, this is just stupid. It's like a factory. It shouldn't be this is the banking model of education where we're just sort of putting concepts into their little little skulls. And, this is just not how it works, actually, especially when you actually look at learning theory. You can actually reorganize work so that it doesn't quite work that way. And a lot of people do. There's a sort of a whole middle range for this in educational development stuff that reorganizes how you learn and learn in groups. And it's actually gender divided in many ways. So anyway, the solutions are not to be modeled. Like, you can't model a school like a factory, even though at various moments it still resembles it. And this is an entirely problematic element in the educational process, which does result in a certain degree of ignorance being proliferated, as though homeschooling will displace education within a school institution. It's just sort of really interesting to see how that works, because it raises a whole nother question about custodial control of children and blah blah blah. Anyway, I've yacked enough. You can yak now too. Anyone? Let's see what the chat says. No, I chased some people away. There's food. I'm hungry too. Um, a tiny, tiny socialist party. There are tiny, tiny socialist parties. Big problem. Big problem there. Now I'm hungry for bread. I tried a gluten-free bread loaf, not made by me, made by a company, and God, did it taste terrible. I just, oh man. I mean, it was made with pumpkin seed and a bunch of other stuff, but I was going, oh, no wonder. God.
There was there
Just
was
had
one
a,
point.
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, mine was about bread. If yours is about capitalism, go ahead. Value, price, and profit rules. Go ahead. Not really.
Well, I was going to ask. There was one point in there where there's sort of constraints on the capitalists, but then sometimes they break through those, anyways. And I
Yeah.
was curious about an example of how that might happen. Or do we have like a real life example of that?
Well, I think that you could say um, that there's a way of reconceiving, well, even a consumption or a consumer economy. You could say, and I'm not really saying it that agrees with that, but the first Apple is designed. The Apple Macintosh is designed to be not like all the other kind of microcomputers of the period, because it's supposed to look more like a Cuisinart. Case design is more like an appliance, and people don't think of computers as appliances, but they certainly are. And you could see that generally, despite all of the capitalist machinations, John Scully et al., it is about thinking about what is the portability of the device. The history of Apple does have all those elements in it, but it also has all these other capitalist elements in it. But I think at its basis, it's still, from a Silicon Valley point of view, which I think is more mythology than reality, is this idea of thinking of a individual or a family life as being more, smart and integrated and, fully automated luxury communism. That's kind of this myth that was the potential of that consumer electronics business, but The reality is it's made us all work harder. Does that make sense?
Well, I'll have to think about it a little bit.
Well, maybe I misunderstood your question. So maybe you could rephrase the question. You wanted
Yeah,
an
let me see if I can
example?
find it. Yeah, I'm trying to find the spot here, and I'm woefully not finding it here. Let's see.
While you're regrouping, I just want to comment. I was thinking this would be a perfect opportunity for the Democratic Party to split up into a Republican Party and a teeny tiny Socialist Party, maybe another couple other ones. You know,
Well, but it's
basically
always
you
done
have
that.
the MAGA, you have the MAGA, and now the Democratic Party is technically where the Republicans were 40 years
Well,
ago. So,
that presumes a certain linear shape to the spectrum of
mm,
how we proceed along a line of conservative versus liberal, but or left or right. Um, it's sort of true that there are still conservative Democrats, some of whom are still in the party, um,
mm,
and who I don't think there's been much defection of conservative Democrats to the Republicans. There is, however, a kind of slippage in the Republicans, which I think that the Democrats should take advantage of on the one hand. On the other hand, Democrats, particularly of the centrist type, tend to be co-opted too easily. In other words, people who think that Liz Cheney should be a Democrat are fooling themselves, you know, um, just as an example. Or Adam Kinzinger, when you actually see what he's still a libertarian of one kind or another, and he's really not a Democrat and should not change parties simply, just because he's being oppressed by the Republicans. Does that make sense to folks?
sure. Still, we need more parties.
Oh, we need more. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, it should be European with multiple
Mm.
parties, but you have to change the entire duopoly system, and
It's the money.
clearly the top of the duopoly doesn't want to have that happen.
I know the People's Party was kind of a bust. I was kind of hoping that at one point that would be a sort of, you know, uh, way, the Democratic Party could be affected and pushed. But I do like Joe's idea. Um, Essentially building, and I don't see the Democratic Party making positive change unless it's forced in some manner of, um, united, powerful force, no matter
Yes, no disagreement there. And in fact, the progressive element in the Democratic Party is, the Green New Deal, while of course, still being lodged in capitalism, actually has some democratic socialism built into it, and so much so, and so scary to the right wing is that they have a new meme or trope that the right wing is pumping out, uh, referring to the Green New Deal. It's just a simple branding thing, but they refer to it now as the Green New Scam, and
Oh,
both Vance and Trump are using this in their little screeds.
oh boy. Okay.
Well, no, I'm just saying that there's certain basic underlying ideas that are important, and the Green New Deal does help to reorganize the economy. And if we could actually get it rolling, we could actually get to democratic socialism. But it's just problematic because it's constantly being co-opted by capitalists.
Yeah.
Capitalists who vote Democratic, and so it's a consciousness thing. I think that consciousness can change and should change because of greenness, but
Right.
green capitalism has been there for as long as I've been around, and it's just always problematic. I'm old enough to remember when there were claims that BMWs were green.
Huh.
That they were green product, that they were the product of green production methods. And well, yeah, there's some, but when you look at the entire industry, who buys BMWs and who doesn't buy BMWs, even though BMWs, of course, from a style point of view, blah, 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 but, whatever.
They
I mean,
just painted all the machinery green.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when BP went beyond petroleum.
Oh, yes, that's right. That's right. And of course, the green business, even though, it's.
And I have to throw in this non sequitur because I enjoy it so much, but I love sewing machines. I'll keep this short, I promise.
Yes.
There was a local repair guy who collected old machines, and it was like a museum. I loved it. And I would go in and he would tell me stories about the machines and the making, da 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 da. He had an Italian machine, and it was painted this interesting dark green. And he said that paint was left over and used by the manufacturer from Mussolini's tanks.
Yes.
And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. So
valorization. That's valorization.
yeah, exactly. I get that now. I didn't have that word then, but yes, ma'am. Thank you for acknowledging my glee. That's really, really cool.
Well, similarly, a lot of machine tools during the war were painted gray because they needed paint, but this was also a lot of extra battleship paint or ship paint, marine paint.
Sure, that makes sense. I get that now. That battleship gray.
Yep.
Yes.
And a lot of that winds up
We sent to them machine tools. You sent them farming equipment.
Oh.
Oh no.
Oh my.
That chicken coop is now a nuclear reactor.
Oh man.
Bill Hicks.
Let's go back to sewing machines.
The peaceful atom. The peaceful atom.
Yes.
Well, I think I'm at the end of my obligatory hour. I thank people for their attention. We can go back to our regular stuff, such as it is. I will note that tomorrow at 3 p.m. I guess we're going to attend collectively or individually class unity and see where they are with their reading, our reading. As I've said, I've tended to take a back seat to that because I don't want to get into what will ultimately become sectarian fights. But I do find their reading list to be really compelling and useful. I mean, aside from the fact that I've discussed a lot of them, and then next week I'm going to try and pick a different direction. And I think I've covered value, price, and profit. Finally, I've sort of hammered it to death. So that's the last I'll be talking about value, price, and profit for a while. And I'm trying to decide where to go next, whether to go to Grundrisse and the maybe early Marx as opposed to late Marx, or go back to, and I think it's enough weeks have passed so that we're finally back to volume 3 of Capital in the Higginbottom lectures. So we may be there by then. We'll see.